Okay. Hi, everybody. Welcome to PrivChat number 5. I think we're live, so let's get this going. So today we're going to be talking about Pegasus and the Pegasus project and spyware and 0 days and governments and companies. And let's bring out some panelists. So first we've got Lakita from Amnesty International. And after that, we've got Etienne, also from Amnesty International. And we'll see if Gus can keep up with my introductions of people. And then last, we've got John from Citizen Lab. And all of these people have been involved in actually doing research and trying to understand what's going on with these companies and the spyware that they're doing. So before we dig into the meat of it, let me remind everybody that this is a Tor fundraiser. So we'd love to get some donations. We'd love to raise awareness about the importance of things like Tor. If you want to become a monthly donor, that would be even better. And we have a new membership project where your company can join Tor as a member. So if your employer relies on Tor or cares about Tor or wants privacy in the world, talk to your employer about becoming a member of the Tor membership project. So with that, let's start off with some background. John, can you tell us what this Pegasus thing is and what NSO Group is and what we're talking about here?
Sure. And Roger, thanks for having us. Great to be talking to this interesting group of people. So Pegasus is the most common brand name for a piece of, we could say, government exclusive spyware sold by NSO Group, which is a cluster of companies with different names and identities. But what it is in a nutshell is remote access sold to governments to cell phones. And the business model is NSO goes and approaches governments and pitches them on the idea of getting usually 0-click, 0-day access to Androids and iPhones, and then turning those phones into digital spies in people's pockets. The reason we're here talking about this particular piece of spyware, of course there are many, and there are even many pieces of spyware in the commercial surveillance industry, is because NSO, its manufacturer, and Pegasus have earned a super notorious reputation because we and researchers at Amnesty International and others keep finding Pegasus used to target and infect the phones of members of civil society, journalists, and others who tell truth and otherwise criticize autocrats around the world. So Pegasus is a piece of spyware, but at this point when we're talking about Pegasus, part of what we're talking about is malware that is used by states often against dissidents. Part of what makes it so tricky is that NSO is constantly finding new 0-day and 0-click vulnerabilities to gain access to devices. And so it makes it very hard for investigators and others to determine whether a device has been infected with Pegasus. And if you're the target, if you're the user that gets targeted with this stuff, there's really very little that you can do to protect yourself. And it's why this is such a problem. In so many ways, Pegasus encapsulates the out-of-control surveillance industry.
Okay, that's a great introduction to some terrible software out there in the world and some perhaps terrible companies. We'll talk about them shortly. Lakita or Etienne, can you tell us about this Project Pegasus thing? What have you been up to?
Yeah, thanks, Roger. I can kick off and then Etienne probably join in. We at Amnesty International have been a technical partner of an investigative consortium called Forbidden Stories, who have essentially worked with media houses around the world to publish this investigation called the Pegasus Project, which went live in July. And the findings were essentially based on a leak of 50,000 phone numbers of potential surveillance targets. And essentially, the Pegasus project found the following. First, that Pegasus was, of course, as John mentioned, being used around the world to put journalists, activists, and others under surveillance. And what this project noted was that was happening on a global, massive scale. And from the investigations, media partners at Forbidden Stories and others were identified 11 potential NSO clients. And I think it's important to name them to see what we're talking about over the next hour and a half. And these include Azerbaijan, Bahrain, Hungary, India, Kazakhstan, Mexico, Morocco, Rwanda, Saudi Arabia, Togo, and the UAE. And important to note that NSO claims to sell only to government clients. The Pegasus project also sort of laid bare how NSO spyware was being used by governments seeking to silence journalists, activists, crush dissent, and social movements, and prove wrong any claims by the company that their spyware is only used. That such attacks against civil society are, arising from any rare or anomalous use of that technology. And while it says that it only sells its spyware for criminal and terror investigations, this project, building upon other work that the Citizen Lab has done, sort of lays bare the fact that this technology facilitates systematic abuse into which NSO Group appears to be complicit. And echoing what John said, lays sort of bare the fact that the industry, along with its government clients, cannot be allowed to operate in this environment where regulation is ineffective, leading to this massive scale of abuse. And so there were a number of technical findings in the project, which I'll hand over to Etienne to speak about.
Yeah, just to briefly mention, so the technical aspect of it, as Nikita said, we're a technical partner of the project, and actually investigating Pegasus attacks is quite challenging. Until around 2018, most of the attacks were happening through a text message with a link. And so if you click on a link, basically it would be open in the browser, and then it would be a zero-day in the browser, zero-day exploit in the system, and then Pegasus will be installed at the core of the system. And so a large part of the work we've done, and Citizen Lab has done a lot of this starting in 2016, has been looking at all these text messages and finding these links that we can attribute to Pegasus. But from 2018, they started to use zero-click attack. So it means that you basically get compromised through either vulnerability in an application or just some network injection, which means that automatically when you're browsing, you're directed to a website attacking you. And so suddenly we could not look at the SMS anymore. So we had to develop new techniques to look at smartphones and find evidences if the smartphone were compromised. And so we have developed a methodology to forensically analyze iPhones. It's way more challenging with Android. We have some ways to do that, but it's way less efficient. And so we have developed a methodology to do that. And through the Pegasus project, we have analyzed phones of activists, phones of journalists, and we have found sign of infection on a lot of them. So we've looked at 67 phones, and we found sign of Pegasus, either targeting or infection, on 37 of them. And so all of this is public now. We have also published tools and indicators, so that other people and other tech people in civil society can also reuse that and defend themselves against this kind of attacks.
Sounds good. So it's a company in Israel that's building a product or service that helps other governments break into phones of whoever those governments want to target. So how do I buy this stuff? How much does it cost? What's the pricing structure?
So it's actually really expensive. It's several millions. The model is based on different things, but mostly the number of people you can attack at the same time. There were a few contracts public in Mexico. We don't exactly know the amount, but it goes between the discussion goes between 50 million and several hundred millions. So it's actually a lot of money. And in Mexico right now, there are a lot of discussions following the revelation and following years of revelation by the Citizen Lab, R3D, and SocialTIC about the usage of public fund to buy that, which I think is a very needed discussion. Yeah, the big problem we have, and we're going to go again through that, is that there is a complete lack of transparency. So since 2016, there was this first attack against Ahmed Mansour, who is an activist from UAE who was targeted. And that was kind of the first clue. And then we keep poking at finding a new person here, a new person there. And we found this whole group of people through the Pegasus project. But at any time, we just see a small part of the picture of abuses. There is no doubt now that these abuses are widespread and they're happening daily. And in situations that are really rough. I mean, we're talking, Nikita mentioned the different countries. We're talking about countries like Hungary or India, where the situation is getting worse and worse regarding human rights. We're talking about countries where there have been a lot of attacks, like Mexico, against journalists. And we're talking about cases I'm keep going back to it, but like Jamal Khashoggi, where the murders of Jamal Khashoggi have been like shocking the world, and Pegasus was involved in targeting people around him. So we're not talking just about a question of like just purely surveillance question. It's always happened in a situation of very strong repression against journalists and human rights defenders.
When I was learning more about this, I was thinking of the NSA TAO, Tailored Access Operations Group, that we learned about from the Ed Snowden documents, and they're like a piece of the NSA that is that's tasked with breaking into people's systems, and a lot of what we're talking about here is basically the same thing. So in a sense, this Pegasus thing is like TAO for hire or something. It's, you don't have to invest in your own group of people who are great at breaking into stuff. You just pay us and we'll take care of it for you. Is it more like a product? Is it more like a service? Like, how much does NSO Group do for you in breaking in, or do they take your $100 million and hand you some software and you need your own team to do the rest?
Well, it's interesting. I think NSO has for years tried to present itself like a product, in part because they don't want people to look at them as responsible for what their customers do with this piece of technology. But the more we learn about how NSO and its Pegasus is actually structured, the more it looks like a service. Because what they do is they go to a government and they say, look, during the period of time that you have a contractual relationship with us, we'll make sure that you can access devices. And moreover, we may make sure that a whole host of infrastructure that we maintain, we control, that actually does the exploitation of those devices is going to remain operational. I think the comparison with other kinds of offensive targeted cyber capabilities like tailored access operations is probably accurate. What I think differentiates NSO and companies like it is that they don't just supply to one government, where there's sort of one focus on maybe trying to avoid detection. Instead, they sell this product and this service to lots of governments, with the result that some of their users are going to be pretty reckless about it and are going to get caught. And it's an interesting feature of the way that NSO and some of these other companies do business, that there is just the constant cycle of revelations about bad use, because they persist in selling to countries that are not just going to use them for, not just going to use the technology for bad purposes, but are going to use it in ways that are so obvious and findable that researchers at Amnesty and Citizen Lab and elsewhere are going to keep finding it. And I think that this sort of helps us think about this as more than just a conversation about one technology. It's really a conversation about the proliferation and the mass proliferation of a capability. And what happens when you start drawing those lines of implication out? What happens when most states in the world are able to ignore other states' borders and hack into those states? And I think where it gets really concerning, beyond the just sort of like, uh-oh, what if everybody can, hack for espionage, is that a lot of states, especially autocrats, dictatorships, and authoritarians, are really looking for ways to export fear and export their ability to control the discourse about them outside of their own borders. And what we see again and again with Pegasus and spyware like it is that dictators will use this to target their diaspora in other countries and target journalists and others who you'd think would have otherwise had the safety of geography, hundreds or thousands of miles between them and the borders of this repressive regime, get collapsed because of this piece of technology. And that's part of why it's so concerning and something that we really have to keep focusing on.
So it's interesting to hear about, it seems like we keep hearing about arms dealers, spyware dealers in Israel in particular. Is there something about the culture there, something about the technology background, something in the water? Like, what is it about Israel where they seem to be the source of a lot of these? Or is that mistaken and actually every country has their own NSO group these days?
To jump in on that, I think that specifically for NSO Group, it has corporate structure presence in other countries as well, aside from Israel, although the NSO Group technology is limited, the entity is based in Israel. I mean, a lot of journalists and scholars have written about the sort of state security, private sector nexus within Israel that could potentially be contributing to it. But I wanted to just flag everyone's attention to the export control regime in Israel, which could potentially be playing a role in this, especially because it is not in line with human rights standards. And it's not just about NSO. For instance, Amnesty's own research in other contexts, more recently in South Sudan, also found Verint to be exporting from Israel into South Sudan lawful interception equipment, and essentially other contexts as well, where the risk of human rights may be higher, which should ideally be stopped by scrutinizing exports prior to transfer if the regime is robust. And so Amnesty International also brought a case in Israel, supported a case in Israel, which essentially seek to revoke NSO Group's export license. And this was essentially towards the Ministry of Defense in Israel. Unfortunately, we did lose the case, but it sort of shows the lay of the land with regard to the export licensing regime in Israel and how much there is to be done for it to be compliant and to be in line with international human rights standards.
Interesting. So the government regulation situation in Israel encourages this rather than discourages this. And at least in the US and Germany and Italy and so on, I mean, yeah, they also have companies with problems like this, but at least some people in the government are trying to figure out how to solve it. And it sounds like people might be excited about it on the Israel side. So speaking of that, let's move into, go ahead, John.
Oh, I just had one more piece of contextual stuff to add, which is George Eliot in the amazing novel Middlemarch has this term, which is when you put a candle on a table, all the scratches appear to be pointing towards the candle. And I think we've learned a lot about NSO, partly for path-dependent reasons. But what's interesting about the past few months is that we've really started also learning about other countries' sort of dirty laundry about this. So before there was NSO, we knew about FinFisher, we knew about Hacking Team coming out of Germany, the UK, Italy. And really recently, we learned about some of these folks who were former NSA who went and worked in the UAE under Project Raven, basically helping the UAE stand up an offensive capability. And I think, although in some ways the conversation about NSO has sort of led a lot of the conversation of global awareness about the spyware industry, and there are really interesting reasons that Lakita pointed to about this, we also have to be aware that there are other players, maybe not with the scope and scale of business as NSO, but that are certainly looking towards the same market and hoping to expand into it. And so I think whatever lesson winds up getting drawn about the NSO case and about whether it's possible to act with this much reckless disregard for human rights when you're expanding your offensive business, everybody else is watching, and a lot of other businesses are watching and perhaps thinking, well, we're going to enter this space too if it looks like NSO is able to make a go of it and not really have much trouble.
And just to also add to that, I think that, the scale of abuse is happening because multiple states are failing at multiple levels, right? Everyone's responsibility, and it isn't only a particular state. So I think like the reason we're seeing the situation is that there is a very little lack of political will across the board to regulate this industry.
And we're talking about NSO because they've gotten busted a couple of times, but we'll talk later about how many more companies there might be that are already happily doing this and just haven't been noticed because they don't sell to the right places. So let's talk about more on the government side. If we were talking about a Chinese company, everybody would be saying, oh yeah, they're basically working with their government and you can't really draw a line between the company and the government. Is that what's going on with NSO in Israel? Like I was reading a story about the French foreign minister talking to the Israeli foreign minister, and I imagine the Israeli foreign minister said, oh yeah, it's a company, we don't control them. But what's really going on there? I can start calling names if needed, but yeah, go for it.
With particular regard to the responsibilities of states that are housing these companies, and we're not just talking about Israel, because like we established, we're talking about a number of sort of entities that host these companies. They have specific human rights responsibilities from perspective of Amnesty, which is the lens that we look at these things from. And the first is that states have a responsibility to ensure that companies operating in their jurisdiction or domiciled in their jurisdiction are respecting human rights. That's currently not the case as it stands. Beyond that, I think it poses large-scale questions about, like we said, the wholesale lack of regulation. And I think this is going to become a constant refrain for the next sort of hour. We have to sort of ensure that we as a, digital rights community also speak about unlawful surveillance with regard to where it is happening, also in conjunction with where it is getting exported from. So in a nutshell, states have a responsibility to ensure that they're not only protecting people from this human rights abuse, which is essentially a violation of right to privacy and also freedom of expression, but also goes in conjunction with other sort of rights. For example, just to give you an example, Amisys and Nexa Technologies were indicted earlier this year for these are surveillance companies that exported to Libya and Egypt, and they've been indicted for complicity in torture at a court in France. And so there are multiple sort of human rights responsibilities that states have for companies operating in their jurisdiction, for companies exporting from their jurisdictions, and for human rights defenders who work in their jurisdictions as well.
Yeah, so there are a bunch of companies in this line. We shouldn't just be picking on NSO Group here. Long ago it was Blue Coat. We mentioned Hacking Team, Finn Fisher. Nobody said Palantir yet, so I'll say Palantir. But there are so many different companies out there and so many different countries where it's happening. And in theory, there's supposed to be some sort of export control or regulation, or you can't sell things that other people use to hurt people. But every time the specifics of exports control and regulation comes up, the companies start explaining that it's dual use, and we're helping people catch criminals, we're helping people catch terrorists, so that you can't call our stuff illegal, and you can't. How are we supposed to know that it was used in ways that we didn't expect? So how does regulation actually work? I think John was talking about this earlier. What would real regulation look like here?
Well, I want to go back to this question of sort of why we're in this position. And I feel like there are strong parallels to the global war on terror. In the period after September 11th, there was a time when a lot of people sort of thought that mercenaries and private military contractors were the same thing as states, or were similar enough that you could be patriotic and work for one, and supporting them was also patriotic and perhaps in the interest of the country that they originated from. We've now had 20 years to see how that plays out, and it turns out that mercenaries are gonna mercenary, and they will always forever be kind of the same thing. Where I think we're at with the spyware industry is not super different from this. A lot of the people who work in these companies come out of military units, national security, parts of government, intelligence services, and they may see what they're doing as sufficiently adjacent to what the government does that they're somehow still working for the same thing. So they can go to sleep at night because they're still working for a certain interest. The reality is this looks a lot more like the arms industry before there was meaningful regulation. The proliferation of this technology is out of control, and it's being justified in different jurisdictions in different ways. But the end result is you have more harm, net more harm. And that's where the industry is absolutely heading us right now. And unfortunately, it seems like a lot of states are reluctant to engage too hard, in part because either they have their own pet industries, they want to play in this space, and so they want to give them some maneuverability, or they want to acquire this stuff, or they want to help other states that they have relationships with acquire it as part of soft power relationships. So we're in a situation where there's a real crisis of leadership and authority, where the rules as they do exist are often sufficiently lenient or interpreted in ways that don't really reflect human rights, as Lakita was evoking earlier, that we don't really have meaningful control or meaningful progress. And the big question for me is, how bad will it have to get before states realize that it may also be in their interests to rein in some of these proliferators? In a sense, it's like what caused the demise of people like Victor Bount. They were so harmful for so many conflicts that finally enough was enough. and enough states had tasted blowback and problem as a result from that. I just don't think we're there with spyware. And the part of me that's really pessimistic thinks we'll have to get there before you see meaningful state action.
What does if we're going to do regulation and we have a law saying this is good, this is bad, you can't do this, what does that law look like in terms of putting stuff on one side of the line or the other? Because each of these companies is going to say, I'm just helping governments protect themselves. We're a national security asset. We're, this is dual use. So long ago I was talking to a Privacy International guy, and he was like, you can't specify it by the technology. His proposal was you look at the brochures. And if the marketing brochures talk about how many bloggers you can arrest per hour, then that's on the wrong side of the line. And at least that would be some beginning. But yeah, how does this work? How do you actually specify in a law in a way that works?
I think successful regulation has to happen in multiple levels. I think one of the main things that we're forgetting, often forget in this conversation, is state action, and the fact that in many of the contexts that we're talking about, whether it be the potential clients that we mentioned, Pegasus Project, is that surveillance is not governed in domestic contexts where we're facing high repression by precise, publicly accessible laws, where surveillance is mandated by, say, a judicial authority, and there is adequate redress and remedy available for someone who may be a victim of unlawful surveillance. So domestic laws for sure need to be overhauled in many contexts and to be made more robust to provide control against unchecked and unlawful surveillance. Then there are laws which need regulations around exports that need to be strengthened. For example, the new EU dual-use export rules have gone into force now, and it remains to be seen how robustly they may be implemented. And at the very least, we've been calling for, breakdowns by export, by end user country, by sales, by contracts, by type of technologies, and this information to be made publicly available for it to be then available for civil society, essentially. And then internationally, I think so much needs to be done with regard to regional, with regard to domestic, with regard to export controls, and to sort of develop a instrument that governs this at a global level, that we need to start having these conversations urgently. And because we're far from this place, Amnesty and many other civil society organizations have been calling for an immediate moratorium, because things as they stand right now, there's an urgent need to put a halt to this technology until regulatory efforts catch up.
Yeah, so I totally buy you can do regulation by making it illegal to hurt people with the software. Like if somebody buys Pegasus and uses it to kill somebody, then the person who used it poorly should obviously be punished. The challenge is the second piece, where you say you're the company that made the software, and you should have known, or you should have made sure not to sell it to that company, or when you sold it to Dubai, you should have known that they were going to resell it to Syria. So that, I guess the other piece of that is we should remember here that it's not as simple as like good governments and bad governments. It's not China would allow this to happen and Israel would allow this to happen, but good thing Germany won't allow this to happen. We can remember the example of lawful intercept and lawful access in internet routers, where it's actually the US and Europe that mandated backdoors in internet routers. And the assumption there was every legal system in the world is the same, so you'll all follow rule of law. So of course, there should be the ability for reasonable police to wiretap the internet, and then everybody seems to be surprised when those same routers get used in UAE, or heck, Italy is another example for wiretapping people in a way that didn't follow rule of law. So, I guess the other side of that is the phrase that I was reading about for what Pegasus was for is serious crime and terror. That's their phrase. They want people to be using it for busting only serious crime and terror, except it seems like everything is terror these days. And it seems like, this goes back to what John was talking about on the war on terror, every time there's a conflict anywhere in the world, both sides call the other one terrorists, and now they can do more that they wanted to do, and at the same time, the U.S. is extrajudicially murdering people with drones using the word terror. So, I mean, is this everything is terror a new phenomenon? How do we get back from it? Because it seems like as long as these companies are going to say we're helping on the war on terror, and all of the people who use their technology are going to say, oh, but they're terrorists, then we're never going to win.
Well, here's the thought. You're absolutely right. NSO's narrative is serious crime and terror. But what we know, in part thanks to the Pegasus project and other research, is that there are actually probably 4 categories. I like to think of them as 4 categories where Pegasus gets used. There's some crime, and there's probably some anti-terror investigation. Then, of course, there's the friendly targeting of dissidents. But the 4th category, which we have now seen for years, is that Pegasus gets used by states that want to do checkbook-style signals intelligence, that don't have the global ability to do it, and so want to buy some kind of CNE capability from some player. And they're going to then use it for all of the priorities that they have. When the Pegasus project came out, we learned, for example, that people like Emmanuel Macron and a bunch of other heads of state were on the potential target list. And we're still learning more cases about that. Now, why would that be the case? Is that serious crime or terror? No. Are they activists? Mm-mm. What they are, though, is potential targets for intelligence gathering. And I think the reality of the industry and marketplace is that this is selling a capability, and states are going to use it as they want. One of the things that you were asking was sort of how do we think about regulation? Lakita made some great points about export control. One thing to think about this industry is that players like NSO want to grow. They get investors, they want to go public, they want to get bigger. The issue is there is a really small number of states that are probably going to carefully use that technology, both keeping it narrowly circumscribed to the serious crime and terror and not using it recklessly in ways that get found out. Everybody else, though, is going to use it for some of these other purposes. NSO's business model is selling to this broader set of states. They know what they're doing. They understand what the implications are. But I think their long-term plan is to get into marketplaces like local police in the US and in Western democracies. This is really scary. It also presents an opportunity. If Western democracies had a backbone and didn't do business with companies like NSO that so clearly fuel rights abuses, it might cause NSO and others to rethink their business model, which I think is partly about growth and maturation until they get a product that they can get into big Western and democracies around the world. And so I think there are actually, I hesitate to say market-driven solutions, but there are other ways that countries can exert pressure beyond just sort of tying their own hands when it comes to what they will export.
Yeah, if I can add one thing to that, I mean, 2 things exactly. The one thing is the question of what would be the ideal world and the ideal solution is a very good one, and it's an endless one. There is so much work to be done. But the truth is, so far, no state has really been willing to put the effort to think and develop that. And we cannot wait until it's done. And that's why the moratorium seems like radical, because there are likely some legitimate use for some of these products, saying like, let's just forbid it completely. But the reason is there are we're talking about hundreds of journalists and activists being targeted, some of them dying, some of them jailed today, like Ahmed Mansour, like Omar Radi. We're in a state where we cannot wait until we have found the perfect solution. And we should not get lost into these debates and make sure that if we forbid things, then state will have an interest into actually developing a legal structure, internationally especially, that's going to make some change. Until there is enough pressure and there is a good reason for them to do that, we're going to be stuck in this loop about, what would work? And then during that time, the abuse continue. And then the other point that John raised, I think the question of investment is a key one. I mean, Hacking Team at its peak had 40 to 50 employees. With NSO, we're talking about a company with more than 700 employees. And there's a reason for that, and the reason is funding. And we're at a turning point where if a company like NSO and the business models that NSO has become an acceptable investment for funds, and these funds are like in Europe, in North America, and so on. They are not like anywhere. They are like in mostly in Western world. Then we have lost. We really, there is a fight there to show that these investments are not legitimate. They are not acceptable when they lead to such widespread human rights violations, and that's not something that it cannot only be solved through regulation. I think there are a lot of other ways to deal with that, and that's including putting pressure on investment and making sure that investor will think it twice before investing into surveillance industry like this.
Roger, I wanted to also just sort of bring it back to your point on that everything is criminal and everything is terror these days, which I think we need to move away from talking about surveillance or spyware as well as sort of ahistorical or decontextual narratives, because it affects different people in different ways as well. This surveillance is not happening in a vacuum. Essentially, it is happening in a post sort of 9/11 world where there's an increasing trend for many governments to criminalize human rights work, to clamp down upon it. There are a number of growing tactics that governments use offline. They threaten, they harass, they imprison, and sometimes even kill. There are a host of tools of digital repression that they're organizing, that they're using, and surveillance happens to be one of them, and it should be looked at in that context where increasingly human rights work is being criminalized. And also it's important to urgently sort of start recognizing that, there may be variable effects on different communities on the fact that they've been unlawfully surveilled. As with any technology, it also has to do with power. So, for example, the effect of unlawful surveillance on women, especially in patriarchal societies, is experienced and varied in multiple ways, as it's not just a violation on the right to privacy and freedom of expression, but also an attempt to police their reputations and bodies. And so it's really important to start bringing these conversations back to the criminalization of human rights work and how this affects different people differently.
This is a great point that governments around the world are each defining what counts as a criminal on their own, and a lot of them are doing it in ways that aren't good for the world. So let's come back to the government side, but I want to talk more about platforms like iOS, like Apple, and what their role is here, and how we got here. So smartphones are horrible things. The obvious answer is nobody should be carrying around one of these surveillance devices and signing yourself up to the Apples of the world, but that doesn't work for a lot of people whose jobs involve doing that. So I guess the first question, okay, so these people had one exploit on iOS, on Apple. So I'll just switch to Android, right? Then I'll be safe?
Well, no. So what's happening is, because of, actually quite random technical reasons, it's harder to investigate Android phones. And so most of the investigation we've done and still was done on phone has been focusing on iPhone, because we have ways to look at the phone in different ways, but also either light touch without like jailbreaking the phone, but also we can also jailbreak the phone, especially until like quite recently there were some ways to do that, and that doesn't work well on Android. So NSO is selling the same service to both for both products. It's likely that the fact that the market is more diverse, and it's honestly quite a mess with Android, make it like more challenging to compromise it. But NSO is actually providing a list of like brands of phone they can hack. So no, it's a question of visibility of what we have, and Android is likely as much at risk as iPhones. We just don't have as much visibility about how the attacks happen.
The truth is that there's absolutely what Etienne said, and the truth is there's very little tactically that a user can do to be robustly resilient against something like Pegasus. And it's why the conversation has to move pretty quickly from something that's mostly about technology and investigation into something that's about policy and regulations, because ultimately Pegasus is a lot like a pathogen for which there is not yet really an immune response on most people's devices. And as NSO continues obtaining and developing more exploits, that's going to remain true for the indefinite future.
Speaking of exactly that, can one of you talk about what tools like Signal and Tor browser and so on can and can't do in the face of Pegasus-style attacks? Like, what do they protect you against? What do they not protect you against? Are they still helpful against other attacks? What should people be thinking in terms of phone security?
Yeah, there have been actually quite some misunderstanding even by some journalists about that. I mean, for a long time, a lot of these tools and like Tor and Signal and end-to-end encryption on communication, which are like crucial, they've been focusing on securing communication, bringing confidentiality and anonymity to communications. And actually, it's likely the fact that it has been, in a lot of cases, way more challenging for states to be able to just wiretap all the conversation thanks to tools like Signals and others that make it more valuable to target phones. And the thing is, one, you can have Signal. Signal is really good at securing like the communication, but the data is on the phone, and once your phone get hacked, you have like everything can be accessed. And that's why there is such a focus on compromising phones, because of course, they have like the microphones, there is cameras, there is GPS, which is already so much data, but there is already a lot of also a lot of information from all these secure applications that you cannot catch just by wiretapping the network. And exactly as John said, the problem we have now is that there is no good solution against Pegasus because of these 0 days. So you can mitigate the risk. Of course, people should still use Signal, and there is even a risk. We have to be mindful that Pegasus is one of the threats among others. And I mean, I've had people coming at me and be like, okay, so Signal is, we should stop using Signal. It doesn't work. And I'm like, no, it's like we should still do everything we were doing, multiple factor authentication, strong password, Tor and Signal and everything, plus other things if you're at risk of attacks like Pegasus. And yeah, and the challenge is the question of making secure devices is, I mean, the question of making secure software is as old as computers are, and there are some improvements, but now, and this improvement, I mean, you have the project, Google Project Zero, you have like even some work at Apple is communicating a bit less maybe about it, but they are doing some work, long-term work to try to secure more their products. But the problem is a question of investment. The more people invest money into finding security issues, the less secure will be. And these companies are investing like money to make like better software, but on the other side, we see a growing market trying to find vulnerabilities. And when you have like hundreds or thousands of people spending millions to find 0 day, find security issues, ultimately, it's way more likely that security will be used to target people rather than being fixed by the people developing the software, or even just reported to Apple or Google to fix it. So I think these companies have a responsibility of working on that, and the challenge there is to find the right way to either, like, some companies prefer to like track actors and specifically look at what some of them, the actors, are doing to fix like 0 day one after the other. Like Project Zero has been like really good at tracking 0 days, including like there is some great work by them a few years ago based on just some information they got about like an exploit and what NSO could hack on Android. They basically found the vulnerability in the Android kernel, which was amazing. But that's just one, and NSO likely and other actors have some others, so they could buy some others. And so there is also a lot of question about like long-term work, about how do we get rid of the vulnerability over long-term work. And these are like very interesting question and crucial question. But again, as John said, as like I'm a tech person, I tend to like for a long time I've been thinking that you can always find an answer with technology. We should not fall into that there. The technical question are there, but nothing will be solved if we don't find legal solution on the other side. And I think, I mean, especially in the tech community, that there is a trend to just try to focus too much on the technical solution sometimes.
That's a great lead into the next topic I wanted to talk about, which is the 0 day economy. But let me spend 10 seconds to remind us that this is a Tor fundraiser. So if you find this stuff important and you want more people thinking about how to make the world safer, consider donating to Tor. Tell your friends. And if your organization cares about privacy or things like Tor, consider joining our membership program. So the next topic I wanted to talk about is exactly that, the zero-day economy. So Apple had this particular vulnerability that we've been talking about because it was used by Pegasus on some people, but and now it's been found and now it's been fixed. Yay! Are there 100 more after that? Like, does burning one 0-day control the industry where they lose it and now they don't have any more? Or are there an infinite number of them? You talked about a whole lot of money out there. How does this work? Where does the equilibrium go?
I think it's a conversation partly about what counts as effective disruption of a threat actor like NSO. And something that we've learned over the years, I think Amnesty and Citizen Lab have both figured this out, and I think others have as well. You can cause a change in the behavior of an adversary like NSO Group. They're obviously close readers of our reports. When you expose certain tactics, or when you burn a 0-day, even a 0-click 0-day. But realistically, I think what you're looking at is perhaps some disruption of service to customers during a relatively circumscribed period of time before they reclaw visibility. And this is partly because companies like NSO can afford to have things in reserve that are either ready to go and have already been weaponized, or are sort of in the path to getting there. And although there may be some fallbacks to more user interaction-based targeting in certain situations, ultimately I think we're all at a place where we recognize that, well, it may be really important for everyone's security to burn some 0-day, in part because 0-day has a nasty habit of not just sticking with one developer, but moseying out to a lot of other players. That's probably not a sustainable model for actually controlling or limiting the harm that a player like NSO does. One of the questions you asked a minute ago that I just want to turn us back to for a second is, what can players like Signal and Tor do? One of the things I think that we're seeing is that players like NSO are looking at ubiquitous and commonly used apps as routes onto devices. Obviously, they did it with WhatsApp back in 2019. More recently, we had this iMessage 0-click. I think there's a tension when you're looking at a sort of secure communication or privacy tool like Tor or like Signal around looking, which may be the only way you're going to find whether you're actually the way that a threat actor is gaining access to a device, and not logging because of all the other considerations that you may have around protecting the privacy of your users. And I think this puts us in a really tricky situation. It puts players like Signal in a really tricky situation, because it may be the case that at any given time a threat actor is like looking at or maybe even leveraging something like Signal. But there are other considerations that go into looking. And boy, is this a hard problem. I wish I had an easy answer for it. It does mean, though, I think we still have to keep thinking and making sure that we ask developers of secure apps to be thinking about how they would find evidence that their platform is being used as a delivery mechanism for malware.
Yeah, this is an age-old problem where, I mean, in the security analysis, in the security world, you think to yourself, I hope that the user has control of their device, and now I'm going to build software that they can use to be safe if they control their device. But as you say, the reality is maybe somebody broke in, but it's worse than that, because Apple controls their device. Like, iOS decides what it does, how it works, when it gets its updates, whether the rest of it is secure. So believing that you control your device while carrying around one of these proprietary corporate Apple surveillance devices is itself a nasty contradiction. So, I mean, we could have a whole separate priv chat on whether smartphones are wise or unwise for society. But let me jump into the 0-day economy side some more. So one of the challenges we've been talking about already is the asymmetry of developing secure software versus having vulnerabilities that other people can use. One of the big debates that's been going back and forth is the world a better place if governments are forced to find vulnerabilities and exploit them one at a time, versus if governments just mandate a backdoor in everything. Like certainly the FBI has been pushing for actually having backdoors in secure communications or backdoors in operating systems so that they don't have to attack anybody. They just get whatever they want to. And there are a bunch of problems with that. The biggest one being there's more than one government in the world. But let's talk about mass surveillance versus targeted surveillance, or mass compromise versus targeted compromise. In the attacks that we're talking about here, is there a fundamental difference in the technology that makes it tailored towards large-scale compromise versus targeted compromise? Or is it just a policy choice about how broadly you want to use it? Like maybe the fact that you need to spend a 0-day forces you to be limited in how many people can get attacked at once. What do you think about that balance?
I mean, we're opening a box about like so many different types of surveillance when you talk about mass surveillance. So there is a question of mass surveillance by government, whether it's just wiretapping networks, all different forms of surveillance. Well, like recently, there is now all the surveillance that's happening in phone application. There is all the question of trackers in application that gather a lot of information, and I think when you look at mass surveillance, it's about gathering some limited information that can be invasive, but some limited information about a lot of people. And then you have to dig into it versus the Pegasus getting like everything. There is nothing that's on the phone that Pegasus cannot get. So it means like GPS tracking, it means like text, like signal messages, like any secure application can have, any private picture, also is there, like recording with a microphone hearing conversation. So it's clearly way more invasive. There are some links between these two worlds. We have heard, for instance, that the American Army actually acquired some data from these trackers in the Muslim Pro app. So basically in a lot of Android apps and likely in iPhone apps, even if we have less visibility, a lot of them get a lot of information, including sometimes like GPS tracking. And so there was this application used by a lot of Muslim Pro to find the way to the direction for prayer that was gathering GPS information. It was free and gathering GPS information and then selling this data through different companies. And that was acquired. And then here we see some links between some form of like mass surveillance that can be turned into a form of more targeted surveillance, even if it's not as invasive. But if we accept these, I think overall the question and the legal way we can fight against both are quite different, and the change are quite different. If we look at all the question about big tech and how invasive Facebook and Google and others are when we talk about private data, this leads to more like all the big question of surveillance capitalism and how they make money, which is very different from the question we have today, which is state surveillance and attacks against human rights defenders.
Roger, if I could just just reminded me of the previous point about big tech and also 0 days. And I think one actor, specifically with regard to targeted surveillance, I want to bring the conversation back to that with regard to big tech's responsibility in 0 days. And one actor I think we've not sort of explored much is the role of investors and what they can do with regard to this vexing problem. So I think like we're in a situation where the business model of surveillance companies like NSO Group is sort of increasingly relying on the exploitation of vulnerabilities in widely used third-party digital platforms, which, of course, the work of Citizen Lab and Amnesty has also shown. And so in many ways, part of the profits of these companies depend on, I would say, undermining the products and ultimately generating costs for technology manufacturers, with the end result sort of that the users of these operating systems are ultimately unsafe. And this sort of question that this business model is something that is common practice is not fully accounted for by investors, and investors and companies actually should assess whether they're invested in both third-party platforms and companies that produce targeted surveillance tech, and whether that sort of provides a conflict of interest that they should look into, whether they should ask questions of surveillance companies within their portfolios, whether the investment manager should ask for greater transparency. The investors should essentially assess the extent to which, through sort of asking questions, extent to which surveillance companies are reliant on the exploitation of these third-party platforms, because it not only opens them up to litigation risk, but also, ultimately security-related risk for their consumers.
And it makes the world as a whole a less safe place. I mean, we have the same argument about whether the NSA should be stockpiling vulnerabilities in Windows or telling Microsoft how to make Windows safer. And the result of that over and over is you learn about a new case where some government just lost its whole stockpile of 0 days, and now they're floating around on the internet, and Russia or other people are buying them or using them or selling them. So yeah, the asymmetry of what our government should be doing, should they be making us safer, or should they be keeping reserve the ability to break into anything they want to, is on a different level than the companies, but it's the same question of what should the responsibility to society be? Are we trying to make stronger software, or are we trying to hoard bugs in the software? So let me ask the mass surveillance question in a different way. So some people in the security community argue that it's the socially better outcome to have attacks that don't scale, because then the authorities are forced to only use the target attacks on the people that are really bad. The reasoning is if you had an attack that works on everybody, like a backdoor, then a lot of people are harmed or at risk. Whereas if you have an attack that really is very targeted, then the authorities will be forced to use them on the real criminals. So, but here we see that once we have this targeted situation, the people that they use them on are the journalists and the bloggers and the politicians and so on. So are we just not limiting the scale enough? Is the logic right, and we just need an even more targeted attack? Or are we getting some glimpse into how corruption and different priorities mean that goal of giving authorities targeted attack abilities is fundamentally flawed, and all around the world they're always going to use it in ways that are not socially good?
So one thought here, I think back in the day, from my understanding of the crypto wars, some of that's a bit before my time, there was a view that it was like, okay, well, we resist mass surveillance and we sort of accept that there may be some targeted surveillance. We're now in a deeply pluralistic world where the capabilities for both things have proliferated so widely that there is no Newtonian piping that means that if there's more of one, there's going to be less of the other. For governments at this point, the answer is yes, all of it and more, please. One area that I wanted to flag, though, when we're talking about the nexus between mass surveillance and targeted surveillance, is online advertising. There's some recent pretty cool reporting by Joseph Cox, some work done by Senator Wyden and others, pointing out the obvious, which is targeted advertising is a royal road for targeting, including targeting with spyware. And I think we all know this to be the case. I think we're in a situation where we can't really set up a nice dichotomy anymore. What is critically important is that we fight to figure out what's actually being done and then make sure there's accountability when there are abuses and try to limit the bad that's happening. I think we're way beyond a time when there was some actor that sort of like civil society and privacy advocates could kind of interact with and say, well, we'll give you a bit and then we're going to take some. That time is over.
Yeah, if I can add one thing to that, like one clear evidence of this is a lot of states in the world have capacity to hack phones and computers, and yet we still see attacks and attacks against end-to-end encryption, attacks to have like backdoors, and government all around the world pushing for that. And it's not like we can just say we're going to these both things are happening. The abuse are happening on one side, and still there is pressure to destroy the security we have and push back against the security we have thanks to end-to-end encryption. So yeah, I think it's a false dilemma, and we should really be careful to not fall into that, because then we get into a situation where the targeted surveillance abuse are going to be worse and worse.
Ooh, let me give a concrete example. I totally agree with Etienne. Like, remember EncroChat, this chat platform that turned out to be like just like a giant, but some rather targeted surveillance device? Well, we now know is that a bunch of governments who were using that to absolutely comprehensively monitor a whole bunch of people were publicly saying that they were blind and that criminals had really gone deaf and that this was a problem. Criminals had gone dark and that this was really a problem. And I think that we're in a situation right now where there are lots of parties with lots of interests, but we can't really expect most states to be forthright about all the different initiatives or things that they have going on at any one time. And I think that means that there's also no place where you can have sort of like a simple prisoner's dilemma or other kind of like game theoretic interaction with a single entity around the balancing between targeted and mass surveillance. Both things are just going to keep happening, and parties are going to lie about what they're doing.
And just also more on concrete examples and the false dilemma bit. I just wanted to give an example of how this is happening in India, for example. There is a lot going on there with regard to potential abuse of Pegasus spyware, which we've known to, that we've seen through forensic traces is targeting civil society and is surveilling human rights defenders, using it along tactics like repression, criminalization, imprisonment, and so on. But at the same time, there are the new IT rules in India that are particularly looking at, mandating companies like WhatsApp to trace the first user of the message. And so, both sort of, trends of like targeted surveillance alongside, in undermining encryption are happening towards the same goals as well in many contexts. So just to sort of give that concrete example as well.
And relatedly, I hate to just jump in again, but with another observation here, which is many states that don't have mass surveillance capability use more targeted capabilities as a version of guerrilla signals intelligence and will fight tooth and nail to continue to find ways to hack devices remotely in order to get something like the access that they know that some of the big players with serious mass intercept capability or backdoor capability have. If they're not able to get Google, for example, to respond to subpoenas, they're going in a different direction.
That's a great reminder that there are many different governments in the world, and each of them will act in their own interests. So any policies that we have that say, well, the U.S. government should only do this, or we assume that criminals in the U.S. will only rely on this technology, there are other countries out there. So this sort of ties us into the home stretch, which is how do we fix it? There's Pegasus, they're attacking people. There's NSO Group, but there's more than just NSO Group. There are governments that all kind of want this to continue because they want it on their own. So let's walk through some various options. John mentioned this arms dealer metaphor before. Would traditional arms control approaches work here? How can they help, and how do they not help?
I'd actually like to hear what Lakita and Etienne have to say about that one.
I mean, I think there are some parallels with regard to both the industries, but I think the existing export controls at least at the EU level, they are governed differently for sort of dual use exports like we were talking about. And I think if we have robust transparency and proper implementation of that would be interesting. And I think a step in the right direction for sure. I think I just wanted to say that there's so reiterate what we were saying in the beginning, on what is to be done. And I think in this regard, we've been saying for a long time that until regulation catches up, that one of the first things we're asking for states to take it seriously and push for it both bilaterally, multilaterally, and in domestic is to call for an immediate moratorium. This issue is too urgent, and we want the breadth and scale of the findings of the work that Citizen Lab does and has done, and now Amnesty. There's an urgent need to halt the activities of the state until regulatory framework is in place. And I think on the subject of what is to be done immediately, I think the one thing that we're forgetting is that there is mounting evidence of real people who have been targeted. Where is the remedy for that? Where are the impartial investigations? Where are sort of countries taking it seriously? And what is the remedy available to them? And is this going to be investigated by various states properly?
When you talk about a moratorium, you talk about halting the industry. Where do you draw the line? So NSO Group is on the wrong side of the line. Is Cisco on the right side of the line because they do internet security and national defense and so on? Like, are we halting the whole computer security industry, or how do you pick out a couple of companies and say you're the ones who are doing evil, when we don't know how many other companies there are that are also doing that in the background? Like maybe Verizon Business has a deal right now with some government where they're helping them break into some place. So how pervasive is this, and can you draw that line and say that part of the industry needs to stop?
With regard to naming the company, I think it is like the approach towards regulation is to describe the technology and to, make room for it to evolve, for regulation to catch up to innovation in that sense, and to continue to revisit this regularly to make sure that the types of technology that are causing human rights violations continue to be added to control lists, continue to be added to emerging regulation, and so on.
Yeah, that seems like a tough. We talked with Etienne earlier in this about how drawing that line is a tough thing that not enough people have explored. But let another thing that's been bugging me. So there's a cool example in the past where folks were looking for evidence of how broad the Pegasus attacks had been, and they ended up basically Z-mapping the internet for evidence of servers run by NSO Group that would show them in a bunch of different countries. Does that scale? I'm going to find a cool trick to try to observe what Pegasus is doing? Like, can you keep that up, or did you get lucky that one time and you found some evidence about Pegasus, and you never know if you're going to get lucky the next time? Like, how scalable is it to actually be observing what they're doing?
That's an interesting question. NSO in a situation where they have dozens or like hundreds of servers, and if they like any company, they have to find ways to deploy that efficiently and make sure they can just like pop up new servers and run the new infrastructure. And that the more they are going to automate things in a way, the more it's going to be possible to find some specific fingerprint to track that. Of course, they can decide they're going to install every server with a different operating system manually and so on, and that would like make it way harder to fingerprint them, but that's also going to be way more work for them. And so this dilemma between for like attack groups, NSO, but also a lot of other attack groups, between making things like independent infrastructure using different malware, changing things a lot versus using the same thing over and over again, which is cheaper and easier, but also easier to track, is going to be a constant dilemma. And the more we track them, the harder we make it for them. Technically they could find ways to avoid that, but that's going to be very expensive for them. And at some point they're going to make a mistake. And the more people track them, the more we are going to catch the mistakes. And so, we should have more people doing this kind of research. And if we cannot track NSO or another actor, because some actors are really good at this and they're really challenging to track, we're going to catch some of them who are not that good, and that will allow to put some transparency, to find some new human rights abuses, make some attributions, and so on. So it's not like it's a cat and mouse game, but the more we make it expensive for the attacker, for NSO and others, the better it is.
Speaking of the transparency side, in terms of how can we fix this, what can you say about the Project Pegasus side in terms of publicizing your results? Is that what role can that play in fixing it, and how far can that get?
Do you mean transparency over like the methodology we have?
No, I mean in terms of the world becoming aware that this is happening, and deciding to change or becoming ashamed or becoming shocked? Or I mean, what's the goal, the outcome of the awareness side, and how far can that get us?
Oh, that's a broad one. I mean, the first attacks against NSO, like by NSO against human rights, by NSO products against human rights defenders, was found in 2016, and it has been basically 5 years of finding new cases in different places and raising awareness. I think we're in a situation because of the Pegasus project that published a lot of cases in a lot of different cases that make it suddenly kind of a worldwide issue. And before that, it was like a question of technology, a bit like NSO, a bit like Mexico, like the country in which it was. And right now, because of how it targeted and the revelation touched so many countries, we are in a point where it is becoming a worldwide issue. And I think that's great, and it's a moment where we need to use that to make as much change as possible. Because we're dependent ultimately on how much pressure we can put on states, how much people care about that, how much people mobilize, are going to spend time and effort to make the government act on that. And so I think we should use that, and it's hard sometimes because you can reveal something and people are like, we have there is so many things. Like if you have a bigger news the other day, no one pay attention. But now we're in a situation where a lot of people focus on that, and we need to make sure that we don't go back to normal business, because that would be the worst. We need to make sure that the momentum of this revelation and the different revelations, CITEM has published more cases, and there are other reporters publishing stories almost every week since July. The momentum of that need to continue, and we need to put pressure so that actually this leads to some change.
Yeah, I've always been fascinated by power asymmetries. Like governments have the armies and the laws. The arms dealers we're talking about have the secrecy, the lack of transparency. The platforms like iOS have control over their users. The targets here have very little power. But in some sense, I mean, imagine there are some really high-profile Pegasus targets. Like, imagine, I don't know, a bunch of French ministers or something turn out to have been attacked by Pegasus. Is that enough? Like, what do you? How high-profile a victim does it need to be before people are really going to care?
I think what needs to happen is that people making decisions about this industry have the durable and accurate perception that they can be targeted at any time, both in their work world and in their most sensitive personal world. And unless they take serious action, that threat is going to continue. We know that authoritarianism survives in a situation where people believe that the state can poke into their personal world without a lot of friction. And what really concerns me is that we're getting into a place where that is the reality, where many states can poke into your most sensitive personal world without a lot of friction. I just hope that we get to a place where governments and others take up their responsibility. It's been an interesting journey. For years, the only things we really heard about Pegasus came from the brave people who were targeted, who came forward and worked with researchers. And then somewhat more recently, back in 2019, WhatsApp, later joined by Microsoft and Google and a bunch of other companies, suing them. And it's only been very recently that we've started seeing governments, notably the French, come out and start saying things about infections of their high-ranking government officials. We need to see a lot more of that. And the bad or good news, depending on how you look at it, is there's a lot more of that out there. The real question is, are states going to go forward and start talking about this and making the reality apparent?
So if I think I'm being targeted, how do I get in touch? How do I report that? Who do I tell?
Well, I mean, we are happy to support human rights defenders and journalists, and in the limit of our capacity, we have also published tools and indicators, and a lot of people now in civil society have the capability to check at phones, and we think it's the question for a while, the question of being able to check a phone and look for malware through what we call quick forensic, just checking is my phone compromised, hasn't been something very easy to do. And so we have tried to develop tools and methodology at Amnesty that can be reused easily by civil society so that more people can do that. And ultimately, it has to be that it's become more widespread knowledge, and more tech people in civil society have this capacity, have this understanding, can do this kind of investigation. Because I mean, NSO is one, but is one actor. There are many more actors on which we have no visibility, just because the network between someone who is targeted, like a journalist somewhere in the world, and someone who is able to help and investigate that, this link was not made. And so we need to have more people being able to do that. We need to create networks for that. There are already some of them. We need to make more networks, better tools, and easier to get knowledge, so that this investigation happen more easily everywhere.
Okay.
The other thing I would point to, so like Amnesty, Citizen Lab does, work with members of civil society, and people do sometimes reach out to us. I would also point out, though, if you're watching this and you have a concern about your digital security and you're part of civil society, Access Now is an NGO that has a really excellent helpline. If you have concerns, you can reach out to them. They'll help you with a lot of things. Another thing I want to plug, I know this is a pretty specialized audience, but don't forget the basics. Many of the people who we see targeted with even really sophisticated stuff also have to do some pretty basic cybersecurity things too. The good news is there are tools and guides available. One I want to just point people towards is something called the Security Planner, which you can find if you DuckDuckGo for Security Planner. Now maintained by Consumer Reports, originally launched by the Citizen Lab. Personalized, expert-driven advice on how to be a bit more safe online. Obviously, nothing like that is going to protect you from Pegasus, but every step that you take is going to increase the cost to hack you and give you a better sense of what your vulnerabilities may be. The reality, though, is we're still in a situation where it's awfully hard to figure out if you've been targeted, and you do need to seek help. And so hopefully some of the things that we've mentioned will help you find that.
Okay, so we're almost at the end. I want to give each of you a chance to say a wrap-up thing, and let me try to frame that with, we've talked about a bunch of different ways of trying to solve this situation: awareness, government regulation, market regulation, shame, targeting the investors. Maybe if we turn that around and look at, like, whose fault is it that the world ended up in this crappy situation? And maybe the better way of asking that question is, I mean, the answer is obviously a little bit of everything, but what's the issue that you're most frustrated with, that seems hardest to solve, that seems most important to solve, that seems like people aren't looking at enough in terms of making the world a better place here? I'll let each of you go.
I'm just going to quickly, I think, also mention that, I mean, not that the most important or the least important, but I think we're at a point where these media revelations have happened. There's been years of reporting, and we're seeing very little by way of sort of legal accountability. And so, I think, after the technical work, I think we as a community need to put the pressure up to call for independent, impartial investigations into, the targeting of human rights defenders, and, just to sort of bring everything back to why we really are doing this. Unlawful target surveillance has real world sort of harm on mental health, physical well-being, and also on families. It is a tactic to weaken social movements. And so the sooner we have accountability for that, the better. And we hope that it doesn't take another investigation of this style for governments to act. The time is now.
I think only what I would like to add is, I studied computer science, and I have been involved in the InfoSec community and worked in the industry before. And one thing that struck me is how little there is of ethical discussions about what we do with technology, and generally with technology and development and everything. But it's also true in the InfoSec community. There are a few communities, and the Tor community is one of them, where actually a lot of question about what do we do and how would we make technology and why are asked, but in a lot of places there are not. And I think we really need to make sure that we have the ethical discussion, that are widespread, that are actually communities, and especially in InfoSec, where this is a key part of what we think about, what we talk about. In a lot of cases, like if we take the case of Hacking Team, there was a separation between the tech people and the management, in a way that what was done by the tools developed by the tech people at Hacking Team was hidden to them. Like who it was sold to was hidden to them. Same in the case of UAE, and so in a lot of cases, people who do think don't know how it's used, and I think that's go back to the question that for a lot of people, doing fun tech stuff is enough. I mean, fun and well paid, and really need to make sure that we ask questions for that, because I mean, I did that. Like, offensive security is fun, but today, if you just think about doing fun, interesting offensive security, on the other sides of the business, someone may be killed by that, and I'm kind of tired, honestly, and a bit sad to see that in a lot of places in the InfoSec communities, these questions are not there as much as they should. And so I really hope that some more cases like this are brought, the more we'll see these kind of conversations.
Wow, Etienne's point is so powerful. At the end of the day, I think if you're watching this, you obviously have some interest in Tor, in privacy, in circumvention, and these things. But I think what Etienne just said is really a call to a little bit of self-reflection and maybe some introspection, but also some awareness of where you sit with respect to problems like this. At the end of the day, Pegasus is a bit of a dipstick in a very big problem space. And I think we all have to ask ourselves whether what we're doing, wherever you sit, whether you're interested in poking around at exploits or whether you sit at a big tech platform and develop things that billions of users have been convinced into trusting their data with, you have to ask yourself where you sit with respect to this problem. So I really would just ask you to take a moment and reflect on the likely real outputs of your work when it comes to impacting communities and people at places of really high risk. Because if 15, 20 years ago, you could be forgiven for not having this kind of thinking, now we're in a place where, real talk, you're burying your head in the sand if you're not asking yourself those questions periodically and not asking it of your team members. I'm sure that NSO's leadership tells people who work there a really good story, and they probably feel themselves as very embattled and adversarial right now with civil society who's constantly misrepresenting all the good work that they do. But I hope that somewhere, some people at places like NSO are thinking about what the other side of this problem space looks like, and maybe picking up Signal and Tor and getting in touch with a journalist.
That sounds like an excellent conclusion here, and bringing it back to the individual people. The answer is that you can make the world a better place by your individual choices. Don't leave it to your large organizations around you, whether they're governments or companies or other things. Okay, awesome. That's been a great Priv Chat number 5. Let me throw in one last plug for Tor and donations. If you like the work that Tor does, or you want to help us make the world a better place, we'd love to hear from you at donate.torproject.org. And if your organization cares about privacy, we'd love to have you on board as a Tor member. And I think there's going to be another Priv Chat in November or December, so stay tuned. And Lakita, Etienne, John, thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.